The carriage lantern went out just as the horses broke into a run. Elara Whitmore gripped the leather strap above her head as the vehicle lurched sideways, wheels screaming against wet cobblestone. Outside, the London night had turned black and close, the fog rolling in from the river thick enough to swallow the gaslights whole. She had left the Grayson townhouse only minutes before, her heart still hammering from the argument inside, and now she could not tell whether the driver had lost control of the horses or whether someone had frightened them on purpose. "Stop," she called out, but her voice was lost under the pounding of hooves. The carriage door had not been latched properly. She had noticed it when she climbed in, too rattled to care, and now it swung open with every jolt, letting in gusts of cold, wet air. Elara pressed herself back against the seat, trying to keep her balance, trying to think. Edmund Grayson's voice was still ringing in her ears, sharp and cold, telling her that no one else would ever want her now that her name had been dragged through every drawing room in the city. She had walked out into the night rather than listen to another word of it, and she had not thought to check whether the driver Edmund provided could be trusted. She thought that now. The carriage struck something in the road, a fallen crate or a stone, and the whole frame shuddered. Elara was thrown forward, catching herself on the opposite seat, and through the swinging door she saw the street rushing past far too fast for safety. They were headed toward the river. She was almost certain of it. The buildings on either side had grown taller and closer together, the kind of narrow lane that led toward the docks, and there was no reason in the world for an honest driver to take her there. "Turn around," she shouted again, pounding on the roof of the carriage with her fist. "Take me back to Grosvenor Square." No answer came. Only the whip cracking again, and the horses screaming, and the wheels striking the cobbles harder and faster until Elara understood, with a cold clarity that cut through her fear, that the man driving her carriage had no intention of taking her anywhere she wished to go. She thought of jumping. She measured the speed of the street outside, the darkness of the fog, and decided that a broken ankle in an unlit alley was better than whatever waited for her at the end of this ride. She had just gathered her skirts in one hand and reached for the swinging door when a shape appeared out of the fog ahead, dark and enormous, blocking the entire width of the lane. A rider on a black horse, standing perfectly still in the path of the runaway carriage. Elara's breath caught. There was no time to call a warning, no time to do anything but grip the strap and brace herself for a crash that would surely kill them both. But the rider did not move aside. He drove his horse forward at an angle, so close to the carriage horses that Elara heard him shout a single sharp command, a word she did not recognize, and somehow, impossibly, the panicked animals responded to a voice that was not their driver's. They slowed. They swerved. The carriage tipped hard onto two wheels, hung there for one endless second, and then crashed back down onto four with a jolt that threw Elara from her seat entirely. She struck the floor of the carriage and everything went quiet, except for the ringing in her ears and the sound of hooves slowing to a walk outside. When the door was pulled fully open, letting in a wash of cold night air, Elara looked up and saw a man silhouetted against what little light remained, tall and broad-shouldered, his greatcoat dark with damp fog. She could not see his face clearly, only the shape of him, and the stillness with which he held himself, as though violence were a language he understood perfectly and had no wish to speak unless he had to. "Are you hurt?" His voice was low, rough at the edges, the voice of a man who did not use it often for gentleness. "I do not think so." Elara pressed a hand to her temple where she had struck the wooden frame of the seat and felt the sting of a small cut. "The driver! Where is the driver?" "Gone." He ran the moment the horses stopped. The man crouched at the open door, and for the first time Elara saw his face by the faint light of a distant street lamp. One side of it was as any gentleman's might be, strong-jawed, composed. The other side bore a long scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, pale and old, the kind of mark left by something far more serious than an ordinary accident. She had heard of such a man. Everyone in London had heard of such a man, though few had ever seen him in the flesh, because he almost never came to town, and when he did not attend balls or dinners or anything that might put him in a crowded room full of curious eyes. "You are the Duke of Wyndcliffe," she said before she could stop herself. Something in his expression shifted, a brief flicker of surprise quickly hidden. "And you are bleeding, miss." "Whitmore, Elara Whitmore." She touched her temple again and found her glove came away with a small smear of red. It did not frighten her nearly as much as it perhaps should have. She was still thinking of the driver who had run, of the lane that led toward the river, of the fact that a man she had trusted enough to climb into his carriage had very nearly delivered her somewhere far worse than a scandal. "That driver did not lose control by accident," the Duke said, as though he had read the thought directly from her face. "He was driving those horses toward the water, landing at full speed on a night with no moon and thick fog. No man does that unless he means for it to happen." Elara's stomach turned cold. Why would anyone want to frighten me like that? "That," he said, offering her his hand to help her down from the tilted carriage, "is a question I would very much like answered myself, since it was my land those horses nearly bolted through, and my name that will be attached to the scandal of a young lady found injured on my property in the middle of the night." She took his hand. It was steady and strong and did not tremble at all, though her own was shaking badly enough that he must have felt it. "I did not ask to be brought to your land, your grace." "No," he agreed, helping her down onto the cobblestones, keeping one arm firm at her back when her knees threatened to give out beneath her. "But here you are, and here I am. And somewhere in this fog is a man who tried very hard to make certain neither of us survived tonight to ask any questions about why." Elara looked past him into the darkness, where the fog swirled thick over the empty lane, and felt, for the first time since the carriage had lurched into its wild run, that the danger was not yet finished with her. "We should not stand here," the Duke said quietly, glancing once over his shoulder toward the shadows near the water. "If he ran, he may not have run far. Can you ride?" "I have never," she stopped herself. This was no time for propriety. "Yes. I can ride." He lifted her onto his horse before she had fully agreed to it, swinging up behind her with the easy strength of a man long used to battle and to danger. And as the horse broke into a smooth canter away from the river lane, Elara Whitmore understood two things with sudden and startling clarity. The first was that someone in London wanted her hurt, or worse, and had very nearly succeeded. The second was that the man everyone warned her never to trust had just saved her life, and had done it without a moment's hesitation, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. They rode in silence through the fog, the city passing by in half-seen shapes, until the tall iron gates of a townhouse rose out of the mist ahead, a single lamp burning steady beside the door. The Duke slowed his horse to a walk. "This is not Grosvenor Square," Elara said. "No," he agreed. "It is my house on Aldgate Street. You will stay here tonight under guard until I can be certain the man who drove that carriage is not still watching the road to your aunt's home." "Your Grace, I could not possibly." "You could and you will," he said, and though his voice remained low and even, there was something in it that brooked no argument, a note of command that must have once carried across a battlefield and been obeyed instantly. "I have already lost men I could not protect. I do not intend to lose a woman I only just met to the same carelessness." Elara opened her mouth to protest again, then closed it. There was something in the way he said it, in the tightness around his eyes when he spoke of men he could not protect, that told her this was not simple stubbornness. It was old grief, worn smooth by time but never fully healed, the kind of grief she recognized because she carried a version of her own. "Very well," she said quietly, "tonight only." He helped her down from the horse at the door, and for a moment, standing close in the lamplight, she saw his scarred face fully for the first time, without shadow or fog to soften it. She did not look away, and she did not flinch, and something in his eyes told her that very few people, in all the years since he had received that mark, had ever done either. "You are not what they say you are," she said, before she had quite decided to say it aloud. "And you," the Duke of Wyndcliffe answered, opening the door to let her inside, "are not nearly as safe as you believed yourself to be an hour ago. We will speak of both those things. But first, Let us see to that cut on your head, and then you will tell me everything about the man who arranged that carriage, because I intend to find out exactly who wanted you dead tonight, and why." Alara stepped into the warm light of the townhouse, her heart still racing, and understood that whatever door she had just walked through, there would be no simple way to walk back out of it again. The physician the Duke summoned in the middle of the night was a quiet, efficient man who cleaned the cut above Alara's temple, declared it shallow enough to heal without a scar, and left a small bottle of tincture on the table before departing as silently as he had come. Alara sat by the fire in a borrowed shawl, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she had not yet tasted, and watched the Duke of Wyndcliffe pace the length of the drawing room like a man counting the walls of a cell. "Tell me about the driver," he said finally, stopping across from her. "Had you seen him before tonight?" No, Lord Grayson said his usual driver had taken ill, and that this man had come recommended by his stable master. Alara frowned into her tea, trying to remember every detail. "He wore his hat low. I did not see his face clearly when I climbed in. And it was Lord Grayson's idea that you take his carriage home. He insisted upon it. He said the fog was too thick for me to walk even the short distance to where my aunt's carriage waited." She looked up sharply. "You think Edmund arranged this?" "I think it is a very great coincidence that a carriage belonging to the man who broke his engagement to you, and who has spent the better part of a year making certain all of London believes the fault was entirely yours, should suddenly take a wrong turn toward the river on the one night you rode in it alone." The Duke's jaw tightened, the scar along it pulling taut with the movement. "I do not trust coincidences, Miss Whitmore. In my experience, they are rarely as innocent as they appear." Alara set down her cup, her fingers trembling only slightly now. She thought of Edmund's face that evening, the cold fury in his eyes when she had told him plainly that she would not be dictated to by a man who had humiliated her publicly, and then expected her gratitude for allowing her back into his company. She had thought his anger was only wounded pride. Now she wondered if it had been something colder than that. "Even if you are right," she said slowly, "why would he go so far? A broken engagement is scandal enough without adding attempted harm to it. If it were ever discovered, he would hang for it. Which is precisely why, if he did arrange it, he will have made certain it could never be traced back to him." The Duke resumed his pacing. "A runaway carriage, a frightened driver who disappears into the fog, a young lady found injured near the river with no one able to say for certain what happened. It would have looked like nothing more than misfortune. No one would have looked twice at Lord Grayson." "Then how do we prove it?" He stopped and looked at her properly for the first time since they had entered the room, and Alara saw something shift in his expression, a flicker of respect that had not been there a moment before. "We," he repeated. "You intend to help investigate the man who very likely tried to have you killed." "I intend to find out the truth," Alara said, lifting her chin. "I have spent a year being spoken of as though I were a fool who ruined her own prospects through carelessness. I will not now sit quietly while the same man who spread those lies tries to erase me altogether. If you will not help me, Your Grace, I will find the truth on my own." For a long moment, the Duke said nothing at all. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but close enough to one that Alara felt something warm uncoil in her chest despite everything. "You are either very brave," he said, "or entirely reckless. Perhaps I am both. Perhaps you are." He crossed to the window, drawing the curtain back an inch to look down at the street below, still wrapped in fog. "You will stay here tonight, as agreed. In the morning I will send word to my sister to call upon you, so that no one may say you spent an entire night alone in a bachelor's house without any lady present to see you settled. And then, Miss Whitmore, we will begin finding out exactly what Lord Grayson has been doing since your engagement ended, and why a driver who was never in his stable's employ suddenly appeared to take you home. You know his household well enough to say that man was not truly in his employ. I know his stable master. We served together before." The Duke did not elaborate on before, and Alara did not ask, though she noted the way his hand rose briefly to touch the edge of his scar, an unconscious gesture, quickly stilled. "I sent a message to him not an hour ago. If a new driver had truly been hired this week, he will know of it. If not, we will know that Grayson lied to you and we will know why. Alara studied him across the firelit room, this man everyone had warned her against, whose scarred face had become the subject of 100 whispered stories she had never quite believed and never quite dismissed either. He did not look at her the way other men did, with pity thinly disguised as concern, or curiosity poorly hidden behind polite conversation. He looked at her as though she were a puzzle worth solving, a person worth protecting, rather than a scandal worth avoiding. "Why are you helping me?" she asked quietly. "You do not know me, and you have every reason to want no part of another scandal touching your name." The Duke was quiet for a moment, turning back from the window. "Because 6 years ago I watched men I could have saved die because I hesitated, because I told myself it was not truly my responsibility, that someone else would surely act before harm was done." His voice had gone low and rough, stripped of its earlier control. "I have not made that mistake since. When I saw that carriage in the fog tonight, driven far too fast down a lane that leads nowhere good, I did not stop to ask whether it was my concern. I simply acted. I do not intend to stop simply because the danger has not yet finished revealing itself." Alara felt something in her chest tighten at the raw honesty of it, at the grief he had clearly carried alone for years, while London filled the silence around him with cruel guesses about his scar and his solitude. She thought of her own year of whispers, of the isolation that had followed her broken engagement, of how very few people had ever bothered to ask her the truth of what happened before deciding what to believe. "They call you cold," she said softly. "They say you shut yourself away because you care for nothing and no one." "And what do you say, Miss Whitmore, having known me for the better part of 2 hours?" She considered the question seriously, the way she considered very little else that people asked her, because most questions in London were not truly questions at all, only invitations to repeat gossip back to its source. "I say that a cold man does not ride out alone on a foggy night and place himself directly in the path of a runaway carriage to save a stranger. I say that a man who cares for nothing does not speak of 6 years past with such grief still fresh in his voice." She met his eyes steadily. "I think London has decided who you are without ever bothering to learn the truth. I know something of what that feels like." Something passed between them then, wordless and immediate, a recognition of shared understanding that neither of them had expected to find in a stranger met by chance in a dangerous fog. The Duke crossed the room slowly and settled into the chair across from her, close enough now that she could see the firelight catching in his dark eyes. "My name is Julian," he said quietly. "Julian Ashcombe, not your Grace, not the Duke, not the scarred man everyone whispers about behind their fans. Julian." "Alara," she answered, and found herself smiling despite the danger of the night, despite the ache above her temple and the fear still coiled tight in her stomach. "It is a pleasure to properly meet you, Julian, even under such circumstances." The circumstances could certainly be improved. He allowed himself the smallest laugh, low and surprised, as though he had not expected to find any humor at all in the wreck of the evening. "Though I confess I have grown accustomed to strange circumstances. My estate manager tells me almost weekly that some new difficulty has arisen that only I can solve, and I have long since stopped expecting an ordinary evening." "Is that why you avoid society so completely? Because ordinary evenings have become foreign to you?" Julian's expression shadowed briefly. "I avoid society because society decided, the moment I returned from the war with this face, that I was either an object of pity or a source of entertainment, and I found I had very little patience for either. It is easier to remain at Wyndcliffe, where the servants have long since stopped staring, than to endure another ballroom full of whispers." "And yet you came to London this week." "Business," he said, though something in the way he glanced away told Alara there was more to it than that. "My sister insisted I attend at least one event this season, and I made the mistake of agreeing before I remembered precisely why I dislike attending them." "Then I am glad you agreed," Alara said, before she could stop herself. "However selfish that may sound, given that your presence here tonight is the only reason I am not still trapped in that carriage, or worse." Julian looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes, and then he rose from his chair and crossed to the door. "You should rest, Miss Whitmore. Tomorrow will bring questions neither of us can yet answer, and you will need your strength for them. I will have a room prepared." "Julian," she said his name deliberately, testing the shape of it, watching the way his shoulders tensed slightly at hearing it from her lips. "Thank you, for tonight, for not hesitating." "Do not thank me yet," he said quietly, pausing in the doorway. "We do not yet know why someone wanted you harmed or how far they are willing to go to finish what tonight began. I would rather you save your gratitude until I am certain you are truly safe." He left her there by the fire, and Alara sat for a long while after he had gone, listening to the settling of the old house around her, thinking of the scar along his jaw and the grief in his voice, and the strange, sudden certainty that had taken root in her chest despite every warning she had ever heard about the Duke of Wyndcliffe. Whoever had wanted her hurt tonight had very nearly succeeded. But in trying to take something from her, they had inadvertently placed her directly in the path of the one person in London who seemed determined not to let anything happen to her again. And Alara found, to her own surprise, that she was not entirely sorry for how the night had unfolded, even as fear still hummed quietly beneath her skin. Somewhere out in the fog, the man who had arranged that carriage was still free, still watching, still waiting for his next opportunity. Alara did not yet know his face or his full reasons, but she intended to find both, and she suspected, watching the door close softly behind Julian Ashcombe, that she would not be searching for the truth alone. Morning arrived pale and cold, the fog from the night before still clinging in thin patches to the rooftops of Aldgate Street. Alara woke in an unfamiliar bed, disoriented for a moment before the memory of the previous night returned in full: the runaway carriage, the scarred stranger on the black horse, the low fire and the quiet confession that had passed between them. She sat up quickly, wincing at the ache above her temple, and found a note waiting on the table beside the bed in a firm, slanted hand. "My sister Charlotte will call upon you within the hour. Please do not leave the house before she arrives. J.A." Alara had barely finished dressing in a gown lent to her by the housekeeper, a plain but well-made thing in soft gray, when a brisk knock sounded at the door, and a young woman swept into the room without waiting for an answer, trailing the scent of lavender and impatience in equal measure. "So you are the young lady who nearly drowned in the Thames last night," the woman said, studying Alara with open curiosity. She was perhaps 2 years younger than Alara, with the same dark eyes as her brother but none of his guardedness, her expression open and quick to shift. "I am Charlotte. Julian sent word before dawn demanding I come at once, which for my brother is practically an act of hysteria, so I confess I am rather eager to hear exactly what happened." "I did not nearly drown," Alara said, managing a small smile despite everything, "though I believe I came close to a great many other unpleasant fates." Sit, tell me everything." Charlotte settled onto the edge of the bed as though they had known each other for years rather than minutes. "Julian's note said only that there had been an accident and that you required a chaperone before he could see you safely home. He did not mention that you were the Alara Whitmore, whose engagement to Lord Grayson ended so disastrously last season." Alara felt the familiar tightening in her chest that always came when strangers recognized her name. "I take it the story has followed me even into your brother's household." "Every story follows everyone in London eventually," Charlotte said, not unkindly. "But for what it is worth, I never believed the version Lord Grayson told. My friend Lucy Bennet was present the night the engagement ended, and she always said the way Grayson described it afterward bore very little resemblance to what she actually witnessed." "What did she witness?" "That you ended things, not the other way around, and that you had good reason to." Charlotte's expression turned shrewd. "Grayson has simply never forgiven a woman for choosing herself over him, and so he rewrote the story until he was the wronged party and you were the fool. Most of London preferred his version because it was simpler, and because gossip enjoys punishing women far more than it enjoys punishing men." Alara stared at her, startled by the bluntness of it, by how closely it matched what she herself had always known to be true, but had never once heard spoken aloud by anyone outside her own family. "You are remarkably direct, Lady Charlotte." "It runs in the family, apparently, though Julian expresses it through silence, and I express it through talking entirely too much." Charlotte's smile softened. "Now, tell me what truly happened last night, before my brother comes back downstairs and decides I have asked too many questions." By the time Alara finished the account, Charlotte's expression had shifted from curiosity to something far more serious. "You believe Lord Grayson arranged it?" "Julian believes it. I am not certain what I believe yet, except that I do not think it was an accident." "Then we must find out for certain, and quickly." Charlotte rose from the bed with sudden purpose. "Come. Julian will already be waiting, and I suspect he has not slept at all, judging by how early that note arrived." They found Julian in the drawing-room downstairs, standing near the window with a folded letter in his hand, and an expression that told Alara, even before he spoke, that the news it carried was not good. "My friend at the stable confirms what I suspected," he said without preamble, as Alara and Charlotte entered. "No new driver was hired this week. Lord Grayson's usual man is in perfect health and was at his post the entire evening, unaware that anyone had used his master's carriage at all." Alara's stomach dropped. "Then the man who drove me was never Edmund's servant. He was someone placed there deliberately, wearing livery he had no right to wear, waiting for the moment you would need a carriage home." Julian's jaw was tight, the scar along it pale against skin gone hard with restrained anger. "Which means either Lord Grayson arranged this himself, using a man from outside his own household so that no connection could be easily traced, or someone else entirely arranged it and wished for the blame to fall upon him." "Who else would want to harm me?" Alara asked, though even as she said it, an uncomfortable thought had already begun to form. "Unless it was never truly about harming me at all. Unless it was about harming you, Your Grace, and I was simply a means to reach you." Julian went very still. Charlotte looked between them, her earlier lightness entirely gone. "Explain," Julian said quietly. "You said yourself that lane leads toward your land," Alara said, thinking quickly now, piecing together fragments she had barely registered the night before. "If I had been found injured, or worse, near your property, in a carriage that could not be easily traced to Lord Grayson, who do you imagine London would have blamed? The reclusive duke with the frightening scar and the reputation for coldness, or a fashionable young lord everyone already believes to be the wronged party in a broken engagement?" The silence that followed was heavy enough that Alara could hear the fire crackling in the grate, the distant sound of a cart rolling past on the street outside. "You believe someone wished to destroy my reputation entirely," Julian said slowly, "by having you harmed on my land in a manner that would appear to be my doing." "I believe it is possible. I do not yet know if it is true." Alara pressed her hands together to stop them trembling. "But if it is, then I was never truly the target at all. I was only the instrument." "That does not make you any safer," Julian said sharply. "If anything, it makes the danger worse, because it means whoever arranged this cares nothing at all for what happens to you personally, only for what your suffering can accomplish against me. A man who is indifferent to harming an innocent party is far more dangerous than one who hates a single specific enemy." Charlotte had gone pale. "Julian, who would want to ruin you so completely, you have been nothing but withdrawn these past years. You have made no enemies that I know of." "I have made no enemies since returning from the war," Julian corrected quietly, and something in his tone made both women go still. "But before that, there were men who believed I cost them a great deal, in ways that had nothing to do with courage or cowardice on a battlefield, and everything to do with money and land and inheritance disputed long before I ever wore a uniform." "Colonel Fairweather," Charlotte said suddenly, her voice dropping, "you do not think—" "I think many things, and I have proof of none of them yet." Julian's hand tightened around the folded letter until the paper creased. "But Colonel Fairweather has made no secret of his belief that Wyndcliffe's northern boundary rightfully belongs to his family, a dispute our grandfathers began, and which the courts settled decades ago in our favor. He has written to my solicitor twice this year alone, each time more threatening than the last. Enough to arrange an attack on an innocent young woman merely to ruin your name and force a settlement in his favor, Alara asked. I do not know. I did not think him capable of violence before last night. Now I am no longer certain what any man is capable of when land and pride are at stake. Julian turned to face them both fully, and Alara saw, beneath the anger, something that looked very much like fear, not for himself, but for the two women standing in his drawing room, both now caught in the same dangerous current. Whatever the truth, we cannot simply wait for the next attempt. Alara, you cannot return to your aunt's house as though nothing has happened. If someone is willing to arrange a runaway carriage in the fog, they will not hesitate to try again in some other manner, and next time I may not be riding past at the right moment. I cannot stay indefinitely in a bachelor's household, Julian. You know that as well as I do. Whatever protection it offers an equal measure of scandal. Then you will stay with me, Charlotte said firmly, surprising them both. I keep my own small house on Farrington Street, respectably chaperoned by my companion, Mrs. Iris Langley, who has the constitution of a fortress and the discretion of a confessor. No one could reasonably object to you staying under my roof while we sort out this matter, and you will still be close enough that Julian can call daily to share what he learns. Julian looked at his sister with an expression of gratitude so plain that Alara felt something turn over quietly in her chest. That is a sound plan. Thank you, Charlotte. Do not thank me yet, Charlotte said, echoing her brother's words from the night before without realizing it, and Alara felt a small, unexpected smile tug at her mouth despite the gravity of the conversation. Thank me once we have found whoever is behind this and made certain neither of you spends another moment looking over your shoulder. It was decided quickly after that. Alara would send word to her aunt, Margaret Whitmore, explaining only that she had taken ill after the ball and was recovering under Lady Charlotte's care. A story thin enough to worry her aunt, but not so alarming as to invite dangerous questions before they had gathered more proof. Julian would send discreet inquiries to two men he trusted from his years in the army, men skilled at finding truths that others wished to keep hidden, to learn more about Colonel Fairweather's recent movements and finances. And Alara, for her part, insisted on writing to Lucy Bennet, the friend Charlotte had mentioned, to learn precisely what she had witnessed the night the engagement to Lord Grayson had ended, in case that old wound held some thread connecting it to the new danger. By mid-afternoon, the household on Farrington Street had become something between a refuge and a war room. Papers spread across Mrs. Langley's dining table, Charlotte pacing as she read through old correspondence between their late father and Colonel Fairweather regarding the boundary dispute. Alara seated across from Julian as he laid out, in careful detail, everything he knew of the men who might wish him harm. You have thought of nothing but enemies and threats for years, haven't you? Alara said quietly, watching him work, noting the practiced efficiency with which he organized information, cross-referenced dates, searched for patterns others might have missed. Even before last night. Julian did not look up immediately from the papers before him. A man who has watched friends die because a threat went unnoticed learns quickly not to make that mistake twice. I suppose you could call it a habit I never managed to leave behind on the battlefield. I do not think it is only a habit, Alara said gently. I think it is something closer to a promise you made yourself, that you would never again fail to see danger coming, even if it means you can never fully rest. He looked up then, and something in his gaze held hers a moment longer than was strictly proper, long enough that Charlotte, glancing over from her stack of letters, cleared her throat pointedly and pretended a sudden fascination with the papers in her hands. You see a great deal, Miss Whitmore, Julian said quietly, for someone who has known me barely a day. Perhaps, Alara answered, because I have spent that same day watching a man who everyone warned me was cold and unfeeling do nothing, but act to protect people who have no claim on him at all. It is difficult not to see clearly, when the truth is standing so plainly in front of me. The afternoon wore on, the light through the windows shifting from pale gold to gray as evening approached, and by the time a servant arrived with a hastily sealed letter from one of Julian's army contacts, the three of them had built between them a fragile, uncertain map of enemies, motives, and unanswered questions. It was not yet enough to name the man who had arranged the carriage. But it was enough, Alara realized as she watched Julian break the seal and begin to read, to understand that whatever danger had found her the night before, she would not be facing it alone, and that the man everyone had warned her against had already become, in the span of a single frightening night, the person she trusted most completely in all of London. The letter contained less than Julian had hoped, and more than Alara had feared. His contact, a former sergeant named Henry Calloway, who now worked as an inquiry agent for gentlemen who preferred their troubles handled quietly, wrote that Colonel Fairweather had indeed traveled to London within the past fortnight, and had been seen twice in the company of a man matching the description Alara gave of her carriage driver, a broad-shouldered figure with a heavy brow and a scar of his own across one knuckle, as though from an old fight. "That is not proof," Julian said, setting the letter down carefully, "but it is far more than coincidence." "It is enough to be frightening," Charlotte said, wrapping her arms around herself despite the warmth of the fire. "If Fairweather truly hired someone to harm Alara in order to ruin your name, Julian, what is to stop him from trying again the moment he learns his first attempt failed?" "Nothing," Julian admitted grimly. "Which is precisely why we cannot simply wait for Calloway to gather more proof at his own pace. We must move more carefully and more quickly than that." It was decided that Calloway would continue his inquiries into Fairweather's finances and recent movements, while Julian himself would call upon the colonel directly, under the pretense of discussing the old boundary dispute, in hopes of reading the truth in the man's reaction to news of the failed attack. Alara insisted on being present for the planning of it, though both Julian and Charlotte firmly refused to let her anywhere near the actual meeting, a point on which Alara found herself, for once, willing to yield, if only because she recognized the sense in it. In the days that followed, a strange and careful rhythm settled over the household on Farrington Street. Julian called each morning, ostensibly to report on Calloway's progress, though Alara noticed he often lingered well past the point where any true business remained to discuss, drawn into long conversations with her in the small parlor while Charlotte, with increasing and obvious amusement, found reasons to leave them alone together for a quarter-hour at a time. It was during one such morning, 5 days after the carriage accident, that Alara finally asked him the question she had been turning over since that first night by the fire. "Tell me about the scar," she said quietly, as they sat together over untouched cups of tea, the morning light soft through the parlor windows. "Not the story London tells, the truth." Julian was quiet for a long moment, his hand rising unconsciously to trace the line of it along his jaw, a gesture Alara had come to recognize as the mark of memory rather than pain. "We were retreating from a position we should never have held in the first place, ordered to hold it far past the point where holding it made any sense. I was young and stubborn and certain that if I simply pushed my men hard enough, we could win ground that was never truly ours to win." His voice had gone low, careful, the voice of a man choosing each word with the precision of someone handling something sharp. "A shell struck close enough to take the side of my face and the life of the man standing beside me, a boy of 19 who had joined only to send money home to his mother. I lived. He did not. I have spent every day since trying to understand why that division fell as it did, and I have never found an answer that satisfies me." Alara reached across the small space between them, and without quite deciding to do it, placed her hand over his. "That is not a story London would ever tell, because it does not paint you as either monster or curiosity. It only paints you as a man who has carried grief honestly for 6 years, without ever once complaining of the weight." "I do not deserve particular credit for carrying grief," Julian said roughly. "I deserve considerably less credit than the boy who did not survive to carry his." "You deserve to stop punishing yourself for surviving," Alara said, her voice gentle but firm. "I have watched you these 5 days, Julian. You have not once acted as though your own safety mattered to you at all, only ever the safety of everyone around you. That is not humility." That is a man who has decided. He is not permitted to value his own life as highly as he values everyone else's. Julian's eyes met hers, startled, as though no one had ever said such a thing to him quite so plainly before. You see entirely too much, Alara Whitmore. I have had a great deal of practice seeing past what people wish me to believe, Alara said, with a small, sad smile. A year of whispered lies about my broken engagement taught me to look past the surface of a story to whatever truth lies beneath it. I have simply turned that same skill toward you, and I find what lies beneath your surface is nothing at all like what London believes. He turned his hand beneath hers, so that their palms met properly, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the quiet between them filled with something neither yet had the courage to name aloud. It was Charlotte's return to the parlor, humming loudly enough to announce her presence well before she entered the room, that finally broke the moment, and Alara withdrew her hand with a warmth rising in her cheeks that had nothing at all to do with the fire. That afternoon, Julian rode to call upon Colonel Fairweather at his townhouse near St. James's, leaving Alara and Charlotte to wait with an anxiety neither bothered pretending did not exist. He returned some hours later, his expression grim but not alarmed, and reported that Fairweather had seemed genuinely startled by the mention of a carriage accident, his surprise appearing, as far as Julian could judge, entirely unfeigned. Either he is a far better liar than I have ever known him to be, Julian said, settling heavily into a chair, or he had no knowledge at all of what happened that night. Then who, Charlotte demanded? If not Fairweather, who else stands to gain from harming Alara or ruining you? Alara had been quiet through most of the report, turning something over carefully in her mind, and now she spoke slowly, testing the shape of the thought as she said it aloud. What if it was never truly about ruining Julian at all? What if I misread the purpose of it entirely? Explain, Julian said. Edmund has debts, Alara said. Everyone in London knows it, though few say it aloud, because his family's name still carries enough weight to discourage open gossip on the subject. What if he required money quickly, and believed that harming me, or being seen to have failed to protect me after our broken engagement, would somehow serve his interests? Perhaps by casting suspicion upon you instead, Julian, in hopes that a scandal touching the Duke of Wyndcliffe would distract attention from his own difficulties, or even allow him to position himself as my rescuer after the fact, restoring his reputation at my expense and yours both. Julian's expression darkened. That is considerably more calculating than I gave him credit for. Desperate men often become calculating in ways they never were before, Alara said quietly. I do not know if it is the truth, but I think we have been so certain the danger must come from your enemies, Julian, that we have overlooked how easily it might still come from mine. It was Charlotte in the end who suggested the path forward, her quick mind cutting through the tangle of theories to a simple, practical solution. Lucy Bennet, she said. She has always been closer to Grayson's circle than I have, through her cousin's marriage. If anyone in London has heard whispers of his debts or his desperation, it will be her. Alara, you should write to her again, more directly this time. Ask her plainly whether she has heard anything troubling of Lord Grayson's finances, or his recent behavior. The letter was sent that evening, and the reply came faster than any of them expected, arriving the following morning while they sat together over breakfast. Charlotte read it aloud, her voice growing steadily more troubled with each line. Lucy wrote that Edmund Grayson had, in recent weeks, been seen in the company of moneylenders known to deal with gentlemen whose debts had grown beyond what polite society would forgive, and that whispers had begun circulating, quietly but persistently, that his family estate was mortgaged far more heavily than anyone had previously believed. More troubling still, Lucy had heard, through her cousin, that Edmund had recently made inquiries about the terms of an old betrothal contract drawn up between the Whitmore and Grayson families years before either Alara or Edmund had been born, a contract Alara herself had never known existed, tying a considerable dowry to the match should it ever be completed. A dowry, Alara said faintly, setting down her teacup with a hand that had begun to tremble. He never once mentioned any such contract to me, not during our entire engagement. Because he had no need to mention it, so long as the engagement proceeded normally, Julian said grimly, understanding arriving in his expression like a shadow falling across sunlight. But once you ended things, that dowry would have been lost to him entirely, unless he could somehow force the marriage to proceed after all, or discredit you so thoroughly that no other man would ever offer for you, leaving your family with little choice but to accept his renewed suit as the only respectable path remaining. The room fell utterly silent. Alara felt something cold settle in her stomach as the full shape of it became clear. Not simple cruelty, not wounded pride alone. A calculated, desperate scheme built upon a contract she had never known existed, designed to leave her with no path forward except back into the arms of the very man who had humiliated her. "He did not wish me dead," she said slowly. "He wished me ruined beyond any hope of another match, and frightened enough that, when he arrived to offer his hand again, framing himself as my rescuer from scandal, I would have no choice but to accept." "And the driver's route toward the river," Julian added quietly, his voice tight with barely restrained anger, "toward my land specifically, was meant to ensure that whatever scandal resulted would attach itself to my name as well, removing me as any possible alternative for you, should you somehow survive the ordeal with your reputation still salvageable." Alara looked up at him, this man who had ridden into the fog without hesitation, who had shared with her a grief he had carried alone for 6 years, who now sat across from her with fury on her behalf written plainly across every line of his scarred face, and she understood, with sudden and complete certainty, that whatever Edmund Grayson had hoped to accomplish that night in the fog, he had instead delivered her directly into the company of the one man in all of London capable of standing against him. "We know his motive now," Julian said, rising from his chair with the restless energy of a man who has finally found somewhere to direct his anger. "We know why. What remains is proving it beyond any doubt, and ensuring he can never attempt anything of the kind again." "How?" Charlotte asked. Julian's gaze met Alara's across the room, steady and resolute. "By giving him exactly the opportunity he wants, and being ready for him when he takes it." The plan that took shape over the following days was dangerous in a way none of them spoke of directly, though all three understood it plainly enough. Lord Barrington's annual summer ball, held each year at his grand house on the edge of Hyde Park, was to take place within the week, and every family of consequence in London would attend, Edmund Grayson certainly among them. If Alara appeared there, visibly recovered, visibly unafraid, and more importantly, visibly in the company of the Duke of Wyndcliffe, it would force Edmund's hand. A man planning to present himself as her rescuer could not do so if she appeared to require no rescue at all, least of all from him. He would be forced either to abandon his scheme entirely, or to act again, more openly this time, out of sheer desperation. "It is a considerable risk," Julian said, standing at the window of Charlotte's parlor with his arms crossed, watching the street below as though danger might announce itself there directly. "If he does act again, he may not choose so clumsy a method as a runaway carriage. He will know we suspect him by then." "Which is precisely why we will be watching for it," Alara said, though she could not entirely keep the tremor from her voice. "Julian, I understand the danger, but I cannot spend the remainder of my life hiding in your sister's parlor, waiting for a man to grow tired of scheming against me. If this is the only way to force the truth into the open, then I would rather face it directly than wait in fear for whatever he decides to attempt next." He turned from the window to look at her, and something in his expression softened despite the tension of the moment. "You are, without question, the bravest woman I have ever known, Alara Whitmore. I only wish that particular quality of yours did not so consistently place you directly in harm's path." "Perhaps," Alara said, allowing herself a small, wry smile, "it is simply that I have finally found something worth being brave for." Charlotte, arranging seating plans at the writing desk nearby, made a small, satisfied sound that neither of them acknowledged. though the color that rose in both their faces made her satisfaction plain enough without words. The first difficulty arrived not from Edmund Grayson, but from Alara's own aunt. Margaret Whitmore arrived at Farrington Street 2 days before the ball, her expression thunderous, having finally learned through channels neither Alara nor Charlotte had anticipated that her niece had spent the past week under the Duke of Wyndcliffe's protection, rather than recovering quietly from a simple illness, as she had been told. "You will explain yourself, Alara," her aunt said, seated stiffly in the parlor, refusing even a cup of tea. "And you will explain precisely why I have been lied to for a week regarding your whereabouts, and why half of fashionable London is already whispering that you have taken up residence with a man notorious for his solitude and his scars." Alara had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times in her mind and found, now that the moment had arrived, that none of her rehearsed explanations felt adequate to the truth. "Aunt Margaret, I did not lie to protect a scandal. I lied because I did not yet know how to explain that someone had tried to have me harmed, and that the Duke of Wyndcliffe was the only reason I survived to tell you of it at all." Her aunt's stern expression faltered, color draining slightly from her face. "Harmed? What do you mean, harmed?" Alara told her everything then: the runaway carriage, the driver who vanished into the fog, the discovery of the old betrothal contract and Edmund's mounting desperation. Watching her aunt's expression shift from disbelief to horror to a kind of quiet, furious grief as the full shape of the danger became clear. "That contract," her aunt said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had forgotten it entirely. Your father drew it up when you were an infant, long before anyone could have known what sort of man Edmund Grayson would grow to become. I should have thought to have it dissolved the moment your engagement ended. I am so very sorry, Alara. I placed you in danger through my own carelessness." "You could not have known," Alara said gently, moving to sit beside her aunt and taking her hand. "None of us could have known what Edmund was capable of until it was nearly too late. But it is not too late now, and I do not intend to let it become so." By the time Julian arrived that evening to finalize the arrangements for the ball, Margaret Whitmore had transformed from a woman demanding explanations into a fierce and determined ally, insisting on accompanying Alara to Lord Barrington's event herself, so that no one could whisper that propriety had been abandoned entirely in the pursuit of justice. "I confess, Your Grace," Margaret said, studying Julian with an appraising eye that reminded Alara powerfully of her own mother, long since passed. "I came here today prepared to think very poorly of you, having heard nothing but rumor for years regarding your reputation. I find myself obliged to revise that opinion considerably. I would ask nothing more of you, Lady Whitmore, than that you judge me by my actions rather than by rumor," Julian said, with a small, respectful bow. "I intend to see your niece safely through whatever remains of this danger, whatever the cost to my own reputation in the process." "See that you do," Margaret said, though her tone had warmed considerably, "because I have grown rather fond of her in these past days of worry, and I should be most displeased to lose her now, having only just realized how nearly I did." The night of Lord Barrington's ball arrived with a clear sky and a mild, warm breeze, so unlike the fog of that first dangerous night that Alara found herself almost able to believe, for a fleeting moment as her carriage approached the brightly lit house, that no danger remained at all. The illusion lasted only until she stepped through the grand entrance and felt the weight of 100 curious eyes turned toward her at once, the whispers rising like a tide the moment her name was announced. "Miss Whitmore and the Duke of Wyndcliffe." Julian's arm was steady beneath her gloved hand as they entered together, and though Alara felt her heart racing, she kept her chin lifted, her expression composed, exactly as they had planned. Across the crowded ballroom, she saw Edmund Grayson go very still, his glass of wine paused halfway to his lips, his gaze fixed upon them both with an intensity that made her skin prickle despite the warmth of the room. "He has seen us," she murmured to Julian. "Good," Julian said quietly, his voice pitched only for her ears. "Let him see. Let him understand that whatever he hoped to accomplish has failed entirely, and that you are neither ruined nor afraid." They moved through the ballroom together, greeting acquaintances, exchanging the careful pleasantries that society demanded. And Alara felt, beneath the performance of it, a genuine warmth growing steadily between them, a partnership forged in danger that had somehow become something far gentler and more precious in the days since. When the orchestra began a waltz and Julian, with a small, questioning look, offered his hand, Alara took it without hesitation, stepping onto the dance floor with a man everyone had warned her against and finding, in his arms, a steadiness she had not known she needed until she felt it. "You dance remarkably well for a man who claims to avoid every ballroom in London," she said, as they turned in slow, easy circles beneath the bright chandeliers. "I had an excellent tutor many years ago and considerably more patience for practicing than I have ever had for the actual events themselves." His hand tightened slightly at her waist. "Though I confess, this particular evening has given me rather more reason than usual to appreciate a crowded ballroom." "Careful, Your Grace," Alara said, unable to entirely suppress her smile despite the tension humming beneath the surface of the evening. "Someone might mistake that for flattery." "Then let them mistake it," Julian said, his voice low, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made the crowded room around them seem to fade entirely away. "I find I have grown considerably less concerned with what London chooses to believe about me, so long as you know the truth of it." It was in that moment, with the music swelling around them and the whole of fashionable London watching, whispering, forming their own conclusions about the scarred duke and the scandal-touched young woman turning so easily in his arms, that Alara understood the warning everyone had given her had been entirely, gloriously wrong. There was nothing cold in Julian Ashcombe. There was nothing to fear. What she felt, dancing with him beneath the bright lights while danger still lurked somewhere at the edges of the room, was something she had never expected to find again after the humiliation of her broken engagement, something warm and certain and entirely her own. The waltz ended, and as they stepped apart to applause, Alara caught sight of Edmund Grayson moving purposefully through the crowd toward them, his expression carefully arranged into something like concern, though his eyes remained cold and calculating beneath it. "Alara," he said, his voice pitched to Carrie, drawing the attention of several nearby guests exactly as she suspected he intended. "I had heard the most alarming rumors regarding your health this past week. I confess I am relieved to see you looking so well, though I must say, I am surprised to find you in such company." "Lord Grayson." Alara kept her voice perfectly even, though she felt Julian go tense and alert beside her. "How kind of you to concern yourself with my welfare, given how little concern you showed for it during our engagement." A flicker of something dangerous crossed Edmund's face before he smoothed it away. "I only wish to ensure you are truly safe, my dear. London can be a treacherous place for a young woman without proper protection, particularly one so recently associated with scandal." "I assure you, Lord Grayson," Julian said, his voice low and even though the warning beneath it was unmistakable, "Miss Whitmore is very well protected indeed, and has been every moment since a carriage accident nearly claimed her life a week ago. An accident, I might add, involving a driver who was never truly in your employ, wearing livery he had no right to wear." The color drained slowly from Edmund's face, his careful mask slipping just enough for Alara to glimpse the calculation beneath it. The sudden, sharp fear of a man realizing his scheme had been discovered far sooner, and far more completely, than he had ever anticipated. "I do not know what you mean to imply, Your Grace," Edmund said, his voice tight. "I imply nothing," Julian said quietly. "I state plainly that a man attempted to have Miss Whitmore harmed, using a false driver and a stolen livery, on a night that led directly toward my land, in what I believe was a calculated attempt to force circumstances that would leave her with no choice, but to accept a proposal she had already, quite wisely, refused once before. I state that inquiries into your recent debts, and into a betrothal contract you never disclosed to her, have revealed a motive that grows more troubling with each passing day. And I state, Lord Grayson, that should any further harm come to Miss Whitmore, or to anyone connected to her. The full weight of what I have already learned will find its way not merely to the ears of London society, but to the proper authorities as well." For a long, terrible moment, Edmund said nothing at all, his gaze flicking between Julian and Alara with the trapped, desperate look of a man who has just realized every avenue of escape has quietly closed around him. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving behind a silence that seemed to ripple outward through the nearby guests, whispers rising once more, though this time, Alara noted with grim satisfaction, they were not whispers about her. "That was not the end of it," Julian said quietly, watching the space where Edmund had vanished. "A cornered man is far more dangerous than a confident one. We must be doubly careful now." Alara nodded, the warmth of the waltz still lingering in her chest even as fear coiled anew beneath it. Whatever came next, whatever Edmund Grayson decided to attempt in his desperation, she found she was no longer facing it as the frightened, isolated woman she had been a week before. She stood now beside a man who had proven again and again that he would not hesitate, that he would not look away, and together she believed they could face whatever danger still remained. 3 days after the ball, the desperation Julian had predicted made itself known in the worst possible way. Alara had gone with Charlotte and Mrs. Langley to visit a modiste on Bond Street, a small errand that felt, after the tension of recent weeks, almost blessedly ordinary. They had spent a pleasant hour selecting fabrics, and Alara had allowed herself, for the first time in days, to laugh freely at some small joke of Charlotte's, when the bell above the shop door rang and a man stepped inside whose face she recognized instantly, though she had never before seen him without his hat pulled low against the fog. The driver from that first terrible night stood in the doorway of the modiste's shop, his heavy-browed face set in an expression of grim purpose. And before Alara could fully register the danger, before Charlotte could even cry out a warning, he crossed the small shop in 3 quick strides and seized Alara's arm in a grip hard enough to bruise. "You will come with me quietly," he said, low and rough, "or I will make certain the lady beside you regrets interfering." Charlotte froze, her face pale with terror, and the modiste behind her counter let out a small, frightened sound. But Alara, though her heart hammered wildly in her chest, forced herself to think rather than simply react, remembering everything Julian had told her about the sort of men who took such work, men who valued their own safety above any loyalty to whoever paid them. "If you harm me," she said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage, "you will hang for it, and Lord Grayson will not lift a single finger to save you from the gallows. He will deny ever knowing your name." Something flickered in the man's eyes, a flash of uncertainty that told Alara she had struck closer to the truth than she had dared hope. But before he could respond, before the moment could tip in either direction, the shop door burst open a second time, and Julian Ashcombe stood in the frame, his expression a terrible, controlled fury that Alara had not yet seen from him in all their days together. He must have been riding nearby, Alara realized later, some instinct or arrangement having brought him close enough to Bond Street to reach them within moments of Charlotte's frantic servant running to fetch him. In the instant it took the driver to register the new threat, Julian had already crossed the room, seizing the man's wrist and forcing his grip from Alara's arm with a strength that left no doubt of the years of battlefield training behind it. What followed happened quickly, and Alara would remember it afterward only in fragments. The driver attempting to break free, a struggle near the shop's front window, the terrible crack of impact as the man's fist connected with the side of Julian's head before Julian, moving with a controlled economy that spoke of long discipline rather than rage, subdued him against the counter and held him there, until the shop's frightened errand boy could run for the watchman. It was only once the driver had been taken away, protesting and cursing, and the shop had begun to settle back into shaken quiet, that Alara saw the blood at Julian's temple, a cut nearly identical in placement to the one she herself had suffered that first night in the fog, and felt her own composure finally begin to crack. "You are hurt," she said, her voice unsteady as she reached for him. "It is nothing," Julian said, though he swayed slightly as he said it, and Charlotte, hurrying to his other side, insisted firmly that it was, in fact, a great deal more than nothing. They brought him back to Farrington Street, where a physician confirmed the cut would heal cleanly but recommended rest. And it was there, later that evening, once Charlotte had reluctantly retired and the house had grown quiet around them, that Alara found Julian alone in the small parlor, staring into the fire with an expression she could not quite read. "You should be resting," she said softly, settling into the chair across from him. "I could not rest," he said, "not until I had seen for myself that you were truly unharmed." He turned to look at her then, and what she saw in his face was not the fury of the shop, nor the tenderness of the waltz, but something darker, heavier, a guilt so plain it made her chest ache to witness it. "I nearly failed you today, Alara. If I had been even a few minutes later, if Charlotte's servant had not known exactly where to find me." "But you were not later," Alara said firmly. "You came, you always come." "This time," Julian said quietly. "But I cannot promise it will always be so. I cannot promise you safety, Alara, not truly, not so long as men like Grayson exist in the world, willing to harm an innocent woman to serve their own desperate ends. I have already failed to protect people I cared for once before. I do not know that I could survive failing you as well." Alara felt something cold settle in her stomach, understanding, before he said another word, exactly where this conversation intended to lead. "Julian, do not." "I think," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he was clearly struggling to master, "that the wisest course, the only course that truly protects you, is for you to return to your aunt's household under heavier guard, and for me to step back from your company entirely, at least until Grayson has been dealt with properly by the law. My presence in your life has only made you more of a target, not less. Whatever protection I might offer is outweighed, I fear, by the danger my very name attaches to you." "That is not your decision to make alone," Alara said, rising from her chair, her voice sharper now, edged with a fear that had nothing to do with Edmund Grayson and everything to do with the man before her. "You cannot simply decide on my behalf what risks I am and am not willing to accept." "I am deciding what risks I am willing to accept, Alara, on your behalf, because I care for you far too deeply to watch you harmed again through any connection to me." His voice cracked slightly on the words, the first true admission of feeling he had allowed himself to speak aloud, and it landed between them with a weight that stole the breath from Alara's chest. "I care for you. I have cared for you nearly since that first terrible night in the fog. And it is precisely because I care so completely that I cannot allow my presence to keep placing you in danger." "You are not the danger, Julian." Alara crossed the room to stand before him, her hands trembling but her voice steady with conviction. "Edmund Grayson is the danger, a desperate, cruel man who cares nothing for who he harms in pursuit of his own schemes. You are the reason I am still alive to stand here and argue with you about it. If you step back now, if you leave me to face whatever remains of this alone, you will not be protecting me. You will simply be abandoning me to face it with one less person willing to stand at my side. And if something worse than a cut above my temple happens next time," Julian's voice rose, raw with a fear he had clearly kept carefully hidden until now. "If it is you who is struck, rather than merely frightened, I have already buried men I could not save, Alara. I do not know that I could bear burying you as well, knowing my own selfishness in wishing to remain close to you was the cause of it." "Then let it be my choice to make," Alara said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You do not get to decide alone that loving someone means you must protect them from ever choosing danger for themselves. I chose to stay in London rather than flee to the country when this began. I chose to attend Lord Barrington's ball, knowing full well the risk it carried. I am choosing now to stand here and tell you that I would rather face every danger Edmund Grayson can devise standing beside you than live safely and alone, having sent away the one person who has made me feel, for the first time in over a year, that I am not merely a scandal to be whispered about, but a woman worth truly knowing." Julian stared at her, something raw and unguarded moving across his scarred face, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the fire crackling softly in the silence between them. "I am afraid," he said finally, quietly, the admission clearly costing him something deep and difficult to name. "Not of Grayson, nor of any danger he might still attempt. I am afraid of caring for someone as completely as I have come to care for you, and losing them regardless of how carefully I try to protect them. I have lost people before, Elara, people I loved, people I could not save no matter how fiercely I tried. I do not know that I have the strength to survive losing you as well. Then do not try to survive it alone, Elara said softly, closing the distance between them entirely. Let me stand beside you instead of behind you. Let us face whatever comes together, rather than you carrying the whole of the fear by yourself, as though loving me means you alone must bear every risk of it. For a long moment, Julian said nothing at all, only looked at her with an expression of such raw, unguarded longing that Elara felt her own breath catch in her throat. Then slowly, he lifted his hand and brushed a stray curl from her cheek, his touch gentle despite the roughness of a hand more accustomed to reins and blades than tenderness. I do not deserve you, he murmured. Not this kindness, not this courage, not any part of what you offer me so freely. Let me be the judge of what you deserve, Elara said, her voice barely above a whisper now, the space between them nearly gone entirely. I have made my choice, Julian. I choose you, scars and grief and danger and all of it. I choose you. He kissed her then, gently at first, as though still afraid some part of her might pull away, and when she did not, when her hands rose instead to rest against his chest, the kiss deepened into something far more certain, a promise made without words, sealed in the quiet fire-lit parlor while the rest of London slept on, unaware that the scarred duke everyone had warned against, and the scandal-touched young woman everyone had pitied had, in the space of a single difficult conversation, found something neither of them had ever expected to find again. But even as Elara allowed herself, for one brief and perfect moment, to simply feel the warmth of being chosen and choosing in return, she knew the danger surrounding them had not yet ended. Edmund Grayson's driver had been taken by the watchman, but Edmund himself remained free, his desperation now sharpened rather than dulled by the failure of his scheme, and somewhere beyond the safety of Charlotte's quiet parlor, Elara suspected, he was already searching for one final, more dangerous way to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. The captured driver, once questioned by the watchman and threatened with the full weight of the law, proved considerably less loyal to Edmund Grayson than Edmund had likely counted upon. Within 2 days he had confessed everything, the false livery, the payment he had received, the specific instructions to frighten Elara badly enough that she would require rescue, though he swore, with what Julian judged to be genuine fear, that he had never been instructed to cause her true harm, only to deliver her toward the water landing where a second man, arranged separately, would appear to save her at the critical moment, a rescue meant to be staged entirely for Edmund's benefit. He meant to play the hero, Elara said, reading over the constable's written report with a cold, disbelieving anger. He arranged for me to be terrified nearly to death, simply so that he could appear at the final moment and save me himself, restoring his reputation and forcing my gratitude in the same stroke. A plan considerably more elaborate than I gave him credit for, Julian said grimly, and considerably more cowardly than even I believed him capable of, hiring others to do the frightening while he waited to claim the credit for rescue. But a signed confession from a hired driver was, as Julian's solicitor cautioned them both, unlikely to be enough on its own to bring formal charges against a lord of Edmund Grayson's standing, particularly given how carefully Edmund had ensured no direct evidence connected the scheme to his own hand. What they needed, the solicitor explained, was proof that could not be dismissed as the desperate invention of a man merely trying to reduce his own punishment, proof that came directly from Edmund himself. It was Charlotte, once again, who devised the method by which such proof might finally be obtained. "Write to him," she said to Elara, over breakfast the following morning, her expression alight with the particular energy of someone who has just solved a difficult puzzle. "Tell him you wish to speak privately, that you have learned something troubling about the old betrothal contract, and wish to discuss it before deciding how to proceed. Men like Edmund Grayson cannot resist believing themselves cleverer than everyone around them. If he believes you are still uncertain, still vulnerable, he may say considerably more than he intends, particularly if he believes himself unobserved. "You want to use me as bait," Alara said flatly. "I want to give him enough rope to hang himself with his own words," Charlotte corrected, though her expression sobered considerably at Alara's tone. "But only if you are willing and only with every possible protection in place." Julian would be nearby the entire time, along with the constable, close enough to intervene the instant anything felt wrong. Julian, when consulted, was fiercely opposed to the plan at first, the memory of the shop on Bond Street still fresh enough that the very thought of placing Alara anywhere near Edmund Grayson again made his jaw tighten with barely restrained anger. But Alara, once she had turned the idea over carefully in her own mind, found herself increasingly certain that it offered the only true path to lasting safety. "If we do not end this properly, with real proof that can hold in a court of law," she said quietly, "Edmund will remain free, and free men who have already tried once to harm someone rarely stop simply because their first attempt failed. I would rather face him one final time, carefully protected, than spend the rest of my life wondering when he might try again." In the end, Julian agreed, though only after extracting a series of careful promises regarding exactly how close he and the constable would remain, and only after the solicitor had explained precisely what sort of admission would be needed to secure a genuine prosecution. The meeting was arranged for a quiet corner of St. James's Park, a public enough setting that Edmund could raise no objection to it, private enough within a secluded grove of trees that a careful listener, hidden nearby, might hear every word spoken. Alara arrived at the appointed hour with her heart hammering despite every reassurance Julian had offered, seating herself upon a bench beneath the shade of an old oak, watching the path until Edmund's familiar figure appeared, walking toward her with the same careful, practiced charm he had always worn like a second coat. "Alara." He seated himself beside her, closer than propriety strictly allowed, his expression arranged into something that might have passed, to an untrained eye, for genuine concern. "I confess I was surprised to receive your letter, given how our last encounter ended." "I have had time to consider a great many things since that evening, Edmund," Alara said, keeping her voice carefully uncertain, exactly as they had rehearsed. "The contract my father drew up years ago, the debts I have heard whispered about regarding your estate. I find myself wondering whether the danger I faced these past weeks was truly as random as I once believed." Something shifted in Edmund's expression, a flicker of calculation quickly masked. "You have been listening to gossip, my dear. Surely you do not believe I would ever wish you harm." "I do not know what to believe anymore," Alara said, allowing a tremor of genuine uncertainty into her voice, one that was not entirely feigned, given the danger of the moment. "I only know that a man was hired to frighten me terribly, on a route that led toward the Duke of Wyndcliffe's land, and that you seemed remarkably prepared to comfort me afterward, had circumstances unfolded as planned." For a long, tense moment, Edmund said nothing, his gaze studying her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Then, slowly, something in his composure cracked, the careful mask slipping to reveal the desperate, cornered man beneath it. "You were never meant to be truly harmed," he said, his voice low and urgent, leaning closer than Alara wished to allow. "I only meant to frighten you enough that you would understand how dangerous London can be for a woman alone, unprotected, and how much safer you would be married to a man who could properly guard you. It was meant to remind you of what you had thrown away when you refused me." "You arranged for me to be terrified nearly to death," Alara said, her voice hardening despite herself, "simply to force me back into an engagement I had every right to end." "I did what I had to do," Edmund said, his voice rising now, all pretense of gentleness gone. "That dowry was rightfully mine, Alara. Our fathers arranged it decades ago. You had no right to simply refuse it, to humiliate me before all of London, to leave me facing debts that contract was meant to settle. I did what any desperate man would do. You hired a man to place me in danger." "I hired a man to bring you back to me," Edmund snapped, his hand closing suddenly around her wrist, hard enough that Alara gasped, fear finally breaking through the careful composure she had maintained throughout the conversation. "And I will not allow that scarred fool of a duke to steal what is rightfully mine, whatever it takes to—" "That is quite enough, Lord Grayson." Julian's voice cut across the grove like a blade, and Edmund released Alara's wrist so quickly she nearly fell backward off the bench, his face draining of every trace of color as Julian emerged from the trees, the constable close behind him, along with the solicitor who had insisted on witnessing the confession directly. "You have just confessed, before 3 witnesses and in your own words, to arranging the assault upon Miss Whitmore, and to intending further harm against her should your scheme have failed to secure her compliance," the solicitor said, stepping forward with a small notebook already in hand, his pen moving swiftly across the page. "I would advise you to say nothing further, Lord Grayson, until you have secured proper counsel, though I confess I doubt any counsel in London will find much room to argue against what we have just heard." Edmund's gaze flew from the solicitor to the constable to Julian, and finally, with something like despair, to Alara herself, still seated on the bench, cradling her bruised wrist against her chest. "Alara," he began, his voice cracking, "surely you understand I never meant—" "You meant every word of it," Alara said, rising from the bench with a steadiness that surprised even herself, Julian moving immediately to her side, his hand settling protectively at her back. "You meant to frighten me, to control me, to force me back into a marriage I had every right to refuse. I understand you perfectly, Edmund. I only wish I had understood you so clearly a year ago, before I ever agreed to your proposal in the first place." The constable stepped forward then, and within moments Edmund Grayson, lord of a family name that had carried weight and respect in London for generations, was led away in handcuffs, his desperate protests fading as he was escorted from the park, leaving behind a silence that felt, to Alara, like the first true breath she had drawn freely since the night the carriage lantern had gone out in the fog. "It is over," she said softly, still staring at the empty path where Edmund had disappeared. "It is over," Julian agreed, turning her gently to face him, his eyes searching her face with a concern that had not fully eased despite the danger having passed. "Are you truly unharmed?" "My wrist will bruise," Alara admitted, "but nothing more serious than that. I am, for the first time in weeks, truly and completely safe." Julian's expression softened, the tension that had gripped his shoulders throughout the entire encounter finally beginning to ease. "Then perhaps," he said quietly, "it is finally time we spoke of what comes next, now that the danger no longer stands between us." Alara looked up at him, this man everyone had warned her against, whose scarred face and quiet solitude had hidden nothing more sinister than a heart made careful by grief, and felt something warm and certain settle firmly into place within her chest. "I should like that very much," she said, and when he drew her gently into his arms beneath the shade of the old oak tree, the whole terrible ordeal finally, truly behind them, Alara Whitmore understood that every warning London had ever whispered about the Duke of Wyndcliffe had been nothing more than fear of a man they had never taken the time to truly know, and that she, alone among all of them, had been fortunate enough to see the truth from the very first night the fog rolled in. News of Lord Grayson's arrest spread through London faster than any scandal Alara had ever witnessed, and for the first time in over a year, she found herself at the center of gossip that painted her not as a foolish woman who had ruined her own prospects, but as a survivor of a cruel and calculated scheme, rescued through her own courage and the steady protection of a man society had long misunderstood. The reversal was so complete, so sudden, that Alara found it almost dizzying. The same drawing rooms that had once whispered behind their fans now offering her sympathy and admiration in equal measure, though she found she cared considerably less for their opinion now than she once had, having learned, through weeks of genuine danger, precisely whose good opinion truly mattered. Colonel Fairweather, it emerged through Henry Calloway's continued inquiries, had indeed been entirely innocent of any involvement in the scheme, his earlier threatening letters regarding the boundary dispute nothing more than the blustering of a proud old man convinced of a grievance decades in the making. When Julian called upon him personally to explain the misunderstanding, The colonel, gruff but fundamentally honorable, agreed to submit the boundary dispute to formal arbitration rather than continuing his threats. A small resolution that closed one final loose thread in the tangled web of suspicion the danger had woven around them. Edmund Grayson's trial, when it finally came, was swift and thoroughly damning. The signed confession of his hired driver, combined with the testimony of the solicitor and constable who had witnessed his own admission in St. James's Park, left little room for doubt or leniency. He was found guilty of conspiracy to cause grievous harm, his family's estate seized to settle the very debts that had driven him to such desperate measures in the first place. And though Alara felt, watching the verdict delivered, a small and unexpected pang of sorrow for the wreckage he had made of his own life, she felt no true regret for the part she had played in bringing his scheme to light. "You could not have saved him from himself," Julian said gently, when she confessed this quiet sorrow to him one evening, weeks after the trial had concluded, as they walked together through the gardens at Wyndcliffe, the estate she had only recently begun to think of as somewhere she might, one day soon, call home. "Whatever sympathy you feel for the man he might have been does not erase the harm he chose to cause in becoming the man he is." "I know," Alara said softly, "I do not regret what happened to him. I only find myself grateful, more than I can properly express, that this entire ordeal delivered me somewhere far better than where it found me." Julian stopped walking and turned to face her fully, the late afternoon light catching gently against the scar along his jaw, a mark Alara had long since stopped seeing as anything other than simply a part of the man she loved. "Speaking of where this ordeal has delivered us," he said, and something in his voice made her heart begin to race in a manner entirely unlike the fear she had grown so familiar with over the past months. "I find myself wishing to ask you something, though I confess I have been turning the question over in my mind for weeks now, uncertain of quite the right moment to voice it." "Julian." Alara's breath caught as he reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box, his hand. She noted with quiet wonder, trembling slightly for the first time since she had known him, this man who had faced runaway carriages and hired thugs and desperate lords without ever once losing his composure. "I have spent 6 years believing myself unworthy of the sort of happiness other men take for granted," he said quietly, opening the box to reveal a ring set with a single, simple sapphire. The color, Alara realized with a small, breathless laugh, almost exactly the shade of her own eyes. "I told myself that a man who had failed to save those under his protection had no right to seek joy for himself. That solitude was simply the price I owed for having survived when others had not. And then a runaway carriage nearly delivered you into far greater danger than either of us understood at the time, and instead of finding another reason to retreat further into that solitude, I found, for the first time in 6 years, a reason to step fully back into the world." He knelt slowly before her, the ring held steady now despite the emotion plain in his voice. "Alara Whitmore, you have seen past every scar, every warning, every careful wall I built around myself, and you have loved what you found there regardless. I do not know how I could possibly deserve such a gift, but I find I am no longer willing to question it, only to ask, with everything I am, whether you will do me the honor of becoming my wife." Alara felt tears rise, warm and unbidden, and found she could not have stopped them even had she wished to. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking slightly on the word. "Yes, Julian, 1,000 times yes." And when he rose to slide the ring onto her trembling finger before drawing her into an embrace that spoke of every dangerous, wonderful moment that had led them to this quiet garden, Alara understood that whatever fear had first brought them together in the fog, whatever London had once whispered about the scarred Duke of Wyndcliffe, none of it mattered any longer beside the simple, certain truth of the life they now intended to build together. The wedding, held some months later at the small chapel near Wyndcliffe Estate, was a considerably quieter affair than the grand society weddings Alara had once imagined for herself, and she found she would not have wished it any other way. Charlotte stood as her attendant, radiant with happiness for her brother that had, at times, brought her to tears throughout the preparations. Margaret Whitmore, seated in the front pew with an expression of fierce, protective pride, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief throughout the entire ceremony, and Lucy Bennet, whose honest words had first helped uncover the truth of Edmund's schemes, sat beside her, offering quiet, supportive smiles whenever Alara's gaze found hers across the small, flower-filled chapel. When Julian lifted her veil at last, his eyes bright with an emotion he no longer troubled himself to hide, Alara saw reflected in his face not the cold, frightening Duke London had once warned her against, but a man fully and finally at peace. The grief he had carried for 6 long years transformed, at last, into something gentler, something that no longer needed to be carried entirely alone. That evening, as the small wedding celebration wound down and the guests began to depart into the warm summer evening, Alara stood with Julian at the edge of the estate's gardens, watching the last light fade slowly over the hills that were now, in every meaningful sense, her home. "Do you remember," she said softly, leaning against him as his arms settled naturally around her waist, "what you told me that first night, in your drawing room, when I asked why you were helping a stranger you had only just met?" "I remember," Julian said, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "I told you I had learned not to hesitate, not to tell myself that someone else's suffering was not truly my concern." "I have thought of that often these past months," Alara said. "How very close I came to never knowing you at all, had you hesitated even a moment longer that night, had you decided the runaway carriage was not truly your concern." "I could never have hesitated," Julian said quietly, turning her gently to face him, the last light of evening catching warm against his scarred, beloved face. "Some part of me knew, even before I understood why, that whatever waited inside that carriage was worth every risk of stopping to help. I have never for a single moment regretted that I did." "Nor have I," Alara said, rising on her toes to press a soft kiss to his lips, "regretted a single moment of the fog or the fear or the danger that led us here. Everyone warned me, Julian, that the scarred Duke of Wyndcliffe was a man to be feared, a man too cold and too damaged for a woman like me to ever truly understand. I have never in my life been more grateful to discover that everyone was entirely, wonderfully wrong." Julian smiled then, the small, genuine smile Alara had come to treasure above nearly everything else in the world, a smile that reached fully into eyes that no longer carried only grief, but something far warmer, far more certain. And as the last of the summer light faded gently over Wyndcliffe Estate, the two of them stood together in the quiet garden, no longer strangers warned apart by careless rumor, but partners who had faced real danger together and emerged, at last, into a life neither of them had ever quite believed themselves worthy of finding. London, in time, moved on to whisper about newer scandals, newer stories, as London always eventually did. But among those who had truly witnessed the courage of Alara Whitmore and the quiet, steadfast devotion of Julian Ashcombe, Duke of Wyndcliffe, the story of how they found each other in the fog and fought together against every danger that followed, was never forgotten and never told again as a cautionary tale, but always from that day forward as one of the truest love stories London had ever known. A year passed at Wyndcliffe in a quiet, steady happiness that Alara had once believed belonged only to other people's lives, never her own. She had learned the rhythms of the estate, the names of every tenant family, the particular way morning light fell across the eastern fields, and she had watched, with quiet wonder, as Julian grew steadily lighter with each passing season, the grief that had once seemed permanently etched into his features softening into something closer to contentment. It was on a crisp autumn morning, nearly a year to the day since the runaway carriage had first thrown them together, that the final, unexpected thread of their old danger came seeking them out once more. A letter arrived at Wyndcliffe bearing a seal Alara did not recognize, and when Julian broke it open at the breakfast table, his expression darkened swiftly enough that she set down her own cup at once. "It is from a solicitor representing the Grayson family's remaining interests," he said grimly, scanning the page. "Edmund's younger cousin, it seems, has inherited what little remains of the estate following the seizure of assets, and has apparently spent the past year convinced that our testimony was fabricated, that Edmund was made a scapegoat to protect my own reputation. He demands a meeting here at Wyndcliffe to discuss what he calls a grave injustice done to his family's name. "Do you believe he means to cause trouble?" Alara asked, an old, familiar unease stirring in her chest despite the year of safety behind them. "I do not know," Julian admitted, "but I would rather meet the difficulty directly than allow it to fester unaddressed. We will receive him, with proper witnesses present, and settle the matter plainly." The cousin, a young man named Frederick Grayson, arrived 3 days later, and it became clear within moments of his arrival that grief and inherited shame had curdled in him into something far more volatile than simple confusion. He refused the tea offered, refused to sit, and paced the drawing room with an agitation that set every nerve in Alara's body on alert, memories of that first frightening night rising unbidden despite the year of distance between then and now. "You destroyed my family," Frederick said, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury, "over the word of a woman scorned and a duke eager to steal what my cousin rightfully wanted. I do not believe for a moment that Edmund did what you claim. Your cousin confessed his scheme in his own words before 3 witnesses in St. James's Park," Julian said evenly, though Alara noted the careful way he had positioned himself slightly ahead of her, an old protective instinct that had never fully left him. "The proof was thorough, and the trial was fair. I understand your grief, Frederick, but it does not change the truth of what happened." "Lies," Frederick spat, and before either Julian or the footman stationed discreetly near the door could react, he had crossed the room and seized a heavy brass candlestick from the mantel, his intent, however poorly considered, unmistakable in the wild desperation of his eyes. What followed happened swiftly, the culmination of a year's quiet peace shattering in an instant of renewed danger. Julian moved before Alara could even draw breath to cry out, placing himself fully between her and the young man's raised arm, and though the footman reached them only a heartbeat later, wresting the candlestick from Frederick's grip before any true harm could be done, the moment left Alara's heart hammering with a fear she had thought, foolishly perhaps, that she had left entirely behind her. "Enough," Julian said, his voice carrying the same low, commanding authority Alara remembered from that very first night in the fog, and Frederick, breathing hard, seemed to finally register the full weight of what he had nearly done, his fury collapsing suddenly into something closer to despair. "I only wanted someone to blame," he said quietly, sinking into a chair as the footman held his arm firmly, awaiting instruction. "Everything is gone. The estate, the name, everything my father built. I could not bear that it was truly Edmund's own doing, and not some conspiracy against our family." Julian studied him for a long moment, and Alara, watching the anger slowly ease from his shoulders, understood that whatever fear had gripped her a moment before, Julian's steadiness had already begun to master it, exactly as it always had. "Grief makes fools of reasonable men," Julian said finally, his voice gentler now, though no less firm. "I will not have you charged for what happened here today, Frederick, on the condition that you never again seek out this house, or any member of my household with anything less than civility. Your cousin's choices are not your burden to carry through violence. If you wish to rebuild your family's name, you will do it through honest work, not through misplaced fury directed at those who did nothing more than tell the truth." Frederick left Wyndcliffe within the hour, shaken and silent, and it was only once the sound of his carriage had faded entirely down the long drive that Alara allowed herself to finally sag against Julian's side, the last of her carefully held composure giving way to trembling relief. "I thought that danger had ended a year ago," she said softly, her voice unsteady. "So did I," Julian admitted, wrapping his arms fully around her, his own heart still racing beneath the calm he had maintained throughout the entire confrontation. "But I find I am no longer frightened by such moments the way I once was, Alara. A year ago, I believed danger was something to be faced alone, a burden only I could carry. Today, I understood immediately that whatever came through that door, I would face it with you beside me, and that certainty alone made all the difference." Alara looked up at him, at the scar along his jaw that she had long since ceased to see as anything but simply a part of the man she loved, and felt the last of her fear ease into something steadier, something that had grown, over the past year, into an unshakable trust in the life they had built together. "We will always face it together," she said quietly, "whatever comes. I promised you that in the fog, though I did not yet understand, that first night, quite how many storms we would weather before finding this peace." "Then let us hope," Julian said, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead, "that whatever storms remain ahead of us are considerably gentler than the ones behind." Winter arrived at Wyndcliffe not long after, bringing with it the quiet, settled joy of a household finally at peace. And it was on a cold, bright morning in early December that Alara found Julian in the estate's small library, staring at a letter with an expression she could not quite decipher. "What is it?" she asked, settling beside him. "News from the physician in London," Julian said, and when he turned to look at her, the expression on his face had transformed entirely, wonder replacing whatever uncertainty had come before it. "It seems, my love, that we have rather more than a peaceful winter to look forward to." Alara understood the meaning behind his words before he finished speaking them fully, and felt her own heart fill with a joy so complete it nearly overwhelmed the last lingering shadows of every danger they had faced together. She thought in that quiet moment of the frightened young woman who had once climbed into a carriage on a foggy night, certain her life had already been ruined beyond repair by whispered scandal, and marveled at how impossibly far that woman had traveled since, guided always by a man everyone had warned her to fear, who had instead become the truest safety and the deepest love she had ever known. "A child," she whispered, her hand rising instinctively to rest against her own middle, though it was far too soon yet for any true change to be felt. "Julian, we are to have a child." "We are," he agreed, drawing her close, his voice thick with an emotion he made no effort now to hide. "And I find myself, for the first time in my life, entirely unafraid of what the future holds, whatever storms it may yet bring, because I know now, without any doubt at all, that I will never again face them alone." Outside the library windows, the first snow of winter began to fall softly over the grounds of Wyndcliffe, settling gentle and white across gardens that had once witnessed a desperate proposal, a confession of long-carried grief, and the slow, steady building of a love neither of them had ever expected to find. Alara Whitmore, once warned away from a man London had called too damaged, too dangerous, too cold for any decent woman to trust, sat now in the quiet warmth of that same man's embrace, carrying his child, bound to him by a love forged first in fear and finally completely in trust, and understood with a certainty that settled deep and permanent in her heart, that every warning London had ever whispered had led her, against all expectation, directly to the truest happiness she had ever known,